The Cheesy Man Giant. Written by Jan L. Coates.
Chapter 1. Reading at the RRR.
I've been coming with my mom to volunteer at the Riverside Retirement Residence for 5 years. That's since I was 6 years old. Some of the people who live at the RRR are a little scary looking. Sometimes they have so many wrinkles that it's hard to see their eyes. Some of the people are noisy breathers. A lot of them snore the whole time I'm reading to them. When I'm bored, I like to test the people while I'm reading to them. I start inventing silly stories when I'm supposed to be reading the newspaper. Usually, they just keep sleeping and don't seem to notice. Mr. Johnson is different. He has something wrong with his legs, and he can't get out of bed, so he sleeps a lot. But as soon as I start making up stuff, his eyes pop open. They're bright blue and sparkle like icicles. I worry they might jump right out of his head. Honestly, it's a little scary. I know Mr. Johnson likes sports, so I bring Sports Daily to read to him. Oh, there is one small thing I forgot to mention. I think Mr. Johnson is a giant, but it's hard to tell. He's lying in bed all the time, and he has the biggest bed I've ever seen. There's just enough space for me to squeeze my chair into the room. Even though his bed is so long, his feet still dangle over the edge sometimes. His big hairy toes aren't the most beautiful things I've ever seen, so I cover them up when they stick out. He grunts and moans a lot. Sometimes he even passes gas, out both ends, if you know what I mean. "Hello, Mr. Johnson," I said. "I brought you some sports stories today." Mr. Johnson kept his eyes closed, but he grunted and a bit of gas hissed out of him. I plugged my nose and started to read. When Mr. Johnson began snoring, I started making up my own story. I used my sports broadcaster voice. "For the 4th straight season, Matthew McDougall was named to the National All-Star Basketball Team today. He broke every record in the country again this year. In an interview, McDougall claimed that eating Cheesy Man dinner gave him the strength for such an amazing season."
What?
Mr. Johnson shouted. His icy blue eyes jumped out at me. I closed the magazine. "Sorry, sir, I didn't realize you were awake," I said.
Who is this Matthew McDougall?
Mr. Johnson asked. I turned bright red. "Well, it's me, sir."
Is that true? How could a little midget like you break every basketball record in the country?
He asked. I shook my head. "I was just making up a story. I wish it was true, though." Mr. Johnson stared at me for a long time. Then he laughed. I thought his face might crack. I had never seen him laugh before. He lifted one of his gigantic hairy hands off the blanket and scratched his furry ear.
Are you any good?
He asked finally. "At basketball?" I asked. He nodded. I shook my head again. "Not really. I'm too short."
Ah, I see. I used to have that problem,
he said. "Really?" I said. "But you're so tall."
I wasn't always this tall. I used to be very small when I was your age, believe it or not.
Mr. Johnson wiggled his toes a bit. I noticed that he needed a pedicure. His toenails looked like deadly weapons. "What happened? When did you start to grow?" I asked.
That's a strange story. Do you have a minute or 10?
I nodded.